Hey, this is Jeremy with Old Line Woodwork. Today I'm going to show you how I made new covers for my vent. I used to have these kind like you would get from the store, but the holes were a little bit too big so the screw kept falling out, and even with the drywall anchor it didn't really seem very secure. So I want to show you how I went from this to this. Stick around if you want to find out more. I started with a piece of African pollock that was about 7 feet long, 8 inches wide, and 1 inch thick. My vent opening is 10 inches by 3.5 inches. I want to have an overhang of 2 inches all the way around the vent, so I measured off 15 inches and made a cut with the miter saw. The extra inch or so of material will be trimmed off later. With the cut completed, I now had a board the rough length needed, and I put away my miter saw, which is no easy task. I then took my piece over to the table saw. I adjusted the height of the blade to have the gullet be just higher than the board. I set the fence to about 6 inches and ripped the board, giving me the rough width that I wanted. After it was at its rough dimensions, I took it to the joiner, first making a flat face with a couple of passes, before making a flat and square edge. Note to self, don't set the camera up where I'm working so it doesn't shake when I'm doing things. With a flat face and a square edge, it's back to the table saw to clean up the opposite edge. And next time, don't forget to turn on the dust collection. Now it's time for a couple of passes through the planer to flatten the second face. With that, I'll have a nicely milled piece of lumber. See? Nice. Milled. I took it to the bandsaw next. I set the fence to cut the piece in half, or close to it. Then I, cut it. Back to the planer to clean up the cut and make sure both pieces were equally thick. They ended up about 3/8 of an inch thick, which would be the final height of my vent cover. Because of how thin they are, I had to run them through on a thicker board in order for the planer's rollers to grab them. Next, I marked up the board with layout lines. I ended up with 7 holes to serve as the dampers. I used a 1/4 inch straight bit in my router to make the cuts. Wow, great camera angle here. Believe me, it's the router making the cuts, not some magic voodoo or anything like that. I went back with a 1/2 inch straight bit on the holes on either end and in the middle. With the holes for my dampers cut, I had a pretty big mess to clean up. Now I had to figure out how I was going to attach these to my ceiling. Remember, I couldn't get screws in near the vent because the drywall was torn up. I decided to cut out small squares from some of the earlier scraps. I used the bandsaw to cut them to about a 1/4 inch thick before lugging back out my miter saw. I marked off every 2 inches, cutting them into pieces that were roughly 2 inches square. I took my squares and set them up on the vent covers to see how it would look. I decided they'd attach to the ceiling by magnets. I countersunk holes for some magnets to sit in, even if I did forget to press the record button on that part. I then super glued them in place, which didn't work. We'll talk about that in a bit though. While the super glue was drying, I went back to the table saw. I dropped the blade to about a 1/2 inch and set the angle to about 70 degrees. I then ran each side of both vent covers over the blade to put a profile surround on it. Remember how I said the super glue didn't work? The magnets didn't get stuck, so I mixed up some 5-minute epoxy and filled each hole with it. While the epoxy was drying, it was time to sand. I had some burn marks on the edges that I cut the angles off of, so they took a little longer to sand. I started with 80 grit, then 120, and finally finished with 220 grit. Once they were sanded, I took the pieces with the magnets and glued them in place. For a finish, I used boiled linseed oil. I just put some on a shop rag and put it on, making sure to cover everything as best I could, especially inside each of the damper cutouts. I think they turned out pretty good. If you agree, please like and subscribe.